decided that was the wrong word, actually. It should be more to do with the cultural complexities, if you like. There's a lot of there are a lot of myths around the way in which we understand human beings in a marketing sense. That we tend to think of human beings as rational creatures, and we know that we're not irrational either. We're a combination of the rational and the irrational, and all sorts of other things as well that I'll come on to talk about. But in marketing terms, it's much more convenient to put people in boxes and label them and say this is how people are thinking, rather than accept that there's a lot of complexity and misunderstanding and difficulty in the way that we define people and understand them. Another sort of myth is that everything can be measured, and clearly that's not the case. We know that's not the case, and yet we sort of insist on often treating people as if they can be measured. And a lot of quantitative work, in my view, being provocative here, does that. And I always find quantitative work quite interesting, because we start off, if we're doing questionnaires with human beings, we start off very broadly, and then we define them more narrowly and narrowly, and then we get to a situation where we can put them in terms of numbers. And then we believe those numbers. So, you could argue, and I'm sure a lot of you would, and hopefully will later, that we sort of lost the human being in the numbers. So I think there's a whole area there around what does it mean when we measure people, and what do we lose and what do we gain. There's often a view that relationships are static. And again, we do like to put people in boxes, this typology and that typology and that typology. That isn't actually how we work as human beings. Context is terribly important in terms of how we behave. And if you put us in one context, we'll behave in one way. If you put us in another context, we might behave in a very different way. So that flexibility, that unpredictability in human behaviour is a really important aspect, in my view, to take account of when we're thinking about consumers and what they are. People know why they behave as they do. There's a lot of research that's been done to say that actually most people don't know why they behave as they do. I mean, that isn't true all the time. Lots of times we do know. But it's not a sort of straightforward picture. And we have to accept that life is messy, that consumers' attitudes, behaviours, thinking, feeling is messy as well, and work with that as best we can. And I know it's easy then to say, well, how do we ever work if this is the sort of chaos that we're working within? And I'll come on to talk about that a bit later. Life progresses in straight lines. If, for example, you were looking at a project which involved somebody buying a house, the ups and downs and changes within that long process are huge, aren't they? As anybody who's moved house will know. And so understanding what's happening at each stage is very important. It's how the changes are coming about. It's just as important as the beginnings and the ends. And then we do have this sort of myth that marketers can be objective. I mean, we can't be objective any more than anybody else can be, so we have to accept that the way in which we think distorts or helps what we're trying to do as well. So, from my perspective, I think that in a sense, Jane was talking about this earlier on, that emotion is an essential part of any thinking. And it is, we can't think without emotion. And that's a real turnaround in our culture, isn't it? I mean, not so long ago, we were always taught we had to think sensibly, we had to be rational, we had to... but actually, if we just think rationally, we lose a lot of the sort of the breadth, whatever it is we're trying to consider. There's a very good, there's a guy, Antonio Damasio, I don't know if anybody's read any of his stuff, he's written some fantastic books saying the feeling of what happens. And he talks about how emotion and rationality sort of come together. So from my perspective, I'm saying, well, if we want to understand customers and their journey, we have to start at the basics, really, from where people are. So what are their beliefs, their needs, their aspirations, what's important to them, what's going to make them happy, and live with all those contradictions and the messiness and the ambiguity. In a sense, we have to get down and dirty with them, in a sense. If we want to understand our customers, we have to understand all of those those complexities and contradictions, the humanity. All of our relationships, well, relationships are at the core of what we do. It's what we're born into, and in a sense, we've had millions of years of as human beings developing to this point. And a lot of the beliefs, the way we behave, our relationships with people, are sort of hardwired in a sense. We're hardwired to relate to other people. And in that sense, a customer journey is never solitary. I mean, we often talk about the customer journey, but actually we are social through and through. And that comes out quite clearly when we look at how people are influenced if you look at sort of the contagion that you can have, particularly with maybe a group of teenagers, for instance, if you see them all together. I did some work a while back on teenage road safety, and so we had to watch them going together across the road, and it's very acute with young teenagers, because they all want to be very similar. They want to be part of the group. So seeing how they walk together, how they move together as they cross the road, how they looked inwards into the group as opposed to looking outwards to see if they're going to get run over was really quite fascinating. So there is this sort of wild West myth that there's sort of the cowboy sort of striding out, I'm going to do my thing on my own. But the reality is, much of what we do is influenced by what other people do all the time, without us being aware of it. So we live in a world of relationships, good and bad, or indifferent, and that colours everything we do and feel and see and how we act. And I think we perhaps ignore that too much in marketing terms. We tend to think too much about the customer, not enough about the swaying influences that are happening. I mean, if you just think of a simple conversation that you would have with a friend, if I sort of started talking about something, the friend would listen to it, and what she said would be influenced, what she said back to me would be influenced by what I'd said. And equally, what I said is influenced by what she says. So that conversation is very organic. It's not set down in stone. It's constantly moving in terms of the relationship and shifting that relationship, steering it in ways that neither of us predicted, but happen anyway. And I would argue that life is always like that we're constantly being sort of nudged in different directions. Much of the time, we're not aware of it. So I think we sort of ignore those influences at our peril, in a sense. So I think we as marketers, we need to grapple a bit more. We need to grapple a bit more with human beings. That, if human beings aren't always rational, if they aren't always predictable and malleable, why do we develop often static models that assume that they are? I mean, it's convenient for us, isn't it? I mean, we need to have something that looks like it's the truth. But how true is it if we're really much more malleable than we think? So I would argue that we need to view consumers' experience as it is, more than what it would like to be. I mean, if you just think about our shopping behaviours, we're all familiar with this. We buy on impulse, we have buyer's remorse, we buy the dress we can't afford, the shoes we don't want afterwards. It's not a linear, sequential way of thinking at all, is it? When men might argue differently, I don't know, but so it's we're not in control and conscious of our thoughts a lot of the time, and I know that's a very uncomfortable thing to say, and we will probably argue against it. But I think it's something we have to sort of consciously be aware of when we're working. Now, wouldn't it be nice if everybody reacted in the same way? If all of our customers did the same things, bought the same things, liked the same things? If customer journeys were all the same? If it was a linear process? If they moved on that nice little chart that you sometimes get from the awareness to interest to trial to conversion to advocacy? Wouldn't it be nice? But it's rarely like that. We have to adapt to the customer in front of us, not the customer we have as a sort of idealised model. And there is a strange paradox here, because on the one hand, groupthink is very strong, and I'll come on to show you a little video of this a bit later on. Groupthink is very strong, in spite of the fact that we would argue that it isn't. But at the same time, we're also quite individual in our thinking. We're both at the same time individual and part of a group. And that's a sort of tricky one to get your head around, really. And it's difficult to sort of try and get a snapshot of it. So, you know, that was the customer as we would perhaps like them to be. This is much more like the real customer. Some of you might recognise yourself in there. That people behave differently at different times in different markets. They're often chaotic, rushed, indecisive, looking for shortcuts. You know all of this. And how customers respond depends on the type of shopping, the context, how much time you have, level of interest, the influence of a partner. And so what is the customer? You know, you can take a snapshot. I always think it's a bit like if you've got a young child that you're trying to get a nice picture of, and you sit them on the chair, and they're constantly sort of moving. And you can take lots of pictures and they'll all be slightly different. Because actually, in each of those moments, they're a slightly different person. That's exaggerating, but it does mean...
Sheila, sorry, can you just move? You're getting caught up in wires, and
I'm
really
no.
worried you're going to get fall over.
That would be a good end to it, wouldn't it? So as marketers, we do have to be... Thank you. Yes.
I could just see it happening.
Yes. We have to, actually, it's a good phrase now, we have to be nimble and agile and alert, is what I was going to say. So there we are. I'm doing my best. To be good at improvising, and it's interesting because customer engagement and staff engagement are the great buzzwords now. Everybody's talking about engagement. In my view, improvisation will be the next buzzword, because we live in a world which is changing constantly, we cannot control. And I know I'm overstating all of this, and you know, life isn't quite as extreme as I'm presenting it, but increasingly we will have to improvise, because we can't deal with large structures and organisations in the way that we used to, because organisations are changing. So we will have to be much more nimble and agile and alert, and not fall over the cords and stuff. And I think teaching improvisational skills to customer-facing staff is crucial. They are the organisations that work well, where they know the principles and they apply that, rather than having a script that they learn that we were talking about earlier. So the real guru of all human behaviour at the moment, some of you will be familiar with him, Daniel Kahneman, written that fantastic book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He's a psychologist, a guru of complexity and human behaviour, winner of the 2002 Nobel Prize. And he's often called the father of behavioural economics. And he illustrates how much non-rational, how non-rational much of our behaviour is. And there are a lot of other people working in that area, but I won't go into too much. But he talks about how those ideas and beliefs can be shaped, and points out some of the often irrational rules that influence us in our purchasing. He did one of the studies that he illustrated in his book was quite a nice one. He asked his students to do a word exercise, and it was something about words that sounded the same, yet they had to group them together. So as a group of students, they had about 20 minutes to do this task. And one of the groups was given a set of words which included these: Florida, forgetful, bald, grey, wrinkle. It didn't include old age. So they did this task, and then they weren't told what it was about, and then they were asked to walk down the corridor to another lab where they would do a second task. And doing that task had quite an effect on them. I mean, can you guess what that was?